The dust of redemption settled on everything, a fine brown powder that coated the soul as much as the boardwalk. Jack Riley felt its grit between his teeth as he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store. The town was a scar on the vast, empty plains, a place where the sky was a brutal, endless blue, and the sun bleached the sand to bone white. He had come for supplies, flour, salt, coffee, the simple things that marked the passage of time in the solitary life he had carved for himself. He kept his head down, the brim of his hat pulled low. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he knew its scent, and it hung heavy in the midday air. It started not with a bang, but with a sudden chilling silence. The lazy hum of the town, the blacksmith's hammer, the saloon's off-key piano, the murmur of conversation died all at once. Jack's head came up slowly, his hand hovering near the Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip. Across the street, the doors to the Redemption Bank and Trust swung open. 4 men stepped out, bandanas pulled high over their faces. But it was the man who followed them, and the leader who held Jack's gaze. He wore no mask. His face was handsome, framed by dark hair, but his eyes were as cold and empty as a winter river. He moved with an unhurried grace that was more menacing than any frantic escape. This was Silas Kane. "A profitable morning, gentlemen," Silas said, his voice carrying clearly in the unnatural quiet. It was an educated voice, almost poetic, a stark contrast to the violence he represented. Then a flicker of movement from the sheriff's office. Young Deputy Miller, barely a man, stepped onto the boardwalk, his hand shaking as he drew his revolver. He was a good kid, earnest and idealistic, a boy Jack had mentored during a brief, regrettable attempt to pin on a badge again last year. "Hold it right there." Kane Miller's voice cracked, betraying his terror. Silas Kane smiled, a slow, predatory curve of his lips. "Youthful conviction," he mused, as if commenting on the weather. "It's a beautiful, fleeting thing." Jack was already moving his body, reacting with the muscle memory of 100 such standoffs. He drew his Colt, the motion fluid and economical. "Drop it, Kane," he yelled, his voice a low growl that cut through the tension. "It's over." Silas's eyes flicked toward Jack, a flicker of recognition or something colder in their depths. He didn't seem surprised. For a heart-stopping second, the tableau held the frightened deputy, the calculating outlaw, and the ghost of a lawman caught between them. Then chaos erupted. Silas's men opened fire, their shots splintering the storefronts and kicking up clouds of dust. People screamed and scrambled for cover. Jack returned fire, dropping one of the robbers with a clean shot to the shoulder, but his focus was on Kane. He saw the shift in Silas's posture, the subtle turn toward the deputy. "Miller, get down," Jack roared, but it was too late. Silas Kane raised his Colt, the hammer clicking back with chilling finality. He didn't fire at Jack. He fired at the boy. The shot was precise. Deputy Miller crumpled to the boardwalk, a blossom of crimson spreading across his chest. His eyes, wide with shock and betrayal, found Jack's for a fleeting moment before the light went out of them. A wave of cold fury washed over Jack, so intense it felt like drowning. He fired again, but Kane was already swinging onto his horse, his men providing covering fire. During the chaotic scramble, as Silas mounted something small, and silver slipped from his vest pocket, falling unnoticed into the dust. The outlaws thundered out of town, leaving behind a haze of gun smoke, a dead lawman, and a silence more profound than before. Jack rushed to Miller's side, knowing it was useless. He knelt in the dust, the deputy's blood warm and sticky on his hands. The townspeople began to emerge, their faces pale masks of horror. Sheriff Brody lumbered out of his office, his expression weary and defeated before the fight had even begun. "Damn it, Jack," he muttered, looking at the body. "I told that boy to wait for me." But Jack wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the object glinting in the dirt. He reached for it, his fingers closing around a silver locket tarnished with age, but intricately carved. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in his gut. With a thumb that trembled slightly, he pressed the clasp. It sprang open. Inside, nestled against the worn velvet, was a miniature portrait, faded but unmistakable. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her hair pinned up in a style that was 10 years gone. It was a picture of his late wife, Sarah. The locket was hers. The one he had given her on their first anniversary, the one he had thought buried with her. The world tilted, the sounds of the town fading to a dull roar in his ears. The dust, the blood, the dead boy at his feet, it all coalesced into a single, agonizing point of focus. How? How could a cold-blooded killer like Silas Kane have his dead wife's locket? The robbery was no longer a random act of violence. It was a message delivered with a bullet and sealed with a memory. A message meant only for him. The solitude he had cultivated for years shattered, and the ghosts he had run from were no longer behind him. They were here in redemption, wearing Silas Kane's smile. The ranch was Jack's sanctuary and his prison. Tucked away in a high valley, miles from redemption, it was a place of stark, unforgiving beauty. The wind that swept down from the granite peaks was a constant companion, its lonely howl a fitting soundtrack to his self-imposed exile. He had built the cabin himself, log by sturdy log, his hands shaping a fortress against the world and the memories that hunted him in the quiet hours. The inside was sparse and meticulously clean. The hearth swept the single blanket on his cot, folded with military precision. It was the home of a man who had nothing left but his routines. Days after the robbery, the silver locket sat on the rough-hewn table, a silent accusation in the center of the room. Jack couldn't bring himself to touch it again, but he couldn't put it away. It pulsed with a meaning he couldn't yet grasp, connecting his buried past to a violent present. Each time his gaze fell upon it, he saw Sarah's smile, and then Deputy Miller's wide, unseeing eyes. The guilt was a physical weight pressing down on his chest until it was hard to draw a full breath. He'd left the U.S. Marshals 10 years ago after the raid at Willow Creek. It was supposed to be a simple operation, flushing out a gang of rustlers led by a man named Ethan Kane. But the intelligence was bad. The rustlers were better armed and more numerous than expected. The raid turned into a bloodbath. In the confusion of smoke and gunfire, Jack had been forced into a choice. Ethan Kane had a hostage, a young woman. Jack took the shot. He saved the hostage, but Ethan Kane died instantly. Only later did they discover the woman was Kane's wife, and the whole situation had been a tragic domestic dispute, not a kidnapping. The papers called him a hero. The marshals offered him a commendation. But all Jack could see was the look on the woman's face as her husband fell, a mirror of the devastation he would feel himself just 2 years later when diphtheria took Sarah from him. He had taken a husband from a wife, a life for a life. The weight of that unintended consequence was the reason he'd turned in his badge. He had traded his star for solitude, convinced he was a magnet for violence, a walking storm who brought ruin to everything he touched. A persistent knock on his door a week later pulled him from his brooding. His first instinct was to grab the Colt. The knock was hesitant, however, not demanding. He peered through the window to see a lone horse lathered and tired, and the stooped figure of Jebediah Thorne, a land agent from Redemption. Thorne was a vulture in a dusty suit employed by a wealthy land baron who was systematically buying up every parcel in the valley. Jack was the last holdout. He opened the door a crack. Thorne. Thorne offered a weak, sycophantic smile. Mr. Riley. Just checking in. My employer, Mr. Davies, has authorized me to increase his offer for your land. Substantially. The answer is still no, Jack said, his voice flat. But this valley is all but his thorn whined, gesturing to the vast emptiness around them. It's no place for one man alone. It's unnatural. I like it that way. A muscle feathered in Jack's cheek. Don't come back here, Thorn. Next time I might not be so polite. He shut the door, the finality of the sound echoing in the small cabin. The pressure from the land baron was another low hum of trouble on the horizon, one he'd been swatting away for months. He returned to the table, his gaze falling back to the locket. A rustler named Cain. A killer named Cain. The connection was too stark to be a coincidence. But Ethan Cain had been a common thief, not the architect of a sophisticated robbery. And he hadn't had a brother as far as Jack's memory served. The pieces didn't fit, and the mystery gnawed at him, a fresh wound on top of an old scar. He picked up the locket, its silver cool against his skin. This was the key, the one thing that tied it all together. He just had to find the lock. 2 nights later, a different kind of trouble arrived. It came not with a knock, but with a cry carried on the wind, a thin, broken sound that cut through the mountain silence. Jack was cleaning his rifle by the firelight when he heard it. He froze listening. It came again closer this time, a plea for help. He grabbed his rifle and a lantern, stepping out into the biting cold. The moon was a sliver in the inky sky. He followed the sound to the edge of his property, where a figure had collapsed in the dirt near his fence line. It was a woman, her clothes torn, her face hollowed by hunger and fear. Her hands were pressed to the swell of her belly. She was heavily pregnant. As he drew closer, she struggled to sit up, her eyes wide with desperation. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw. "My baby. We're starving. My husband. He left me." For a long moment, Jack didn't move. His cabin had not known another soul in years. He lived this way, by choice. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to preserve the solitude that kept him and everyone else safe. A woman in trouble was a complication he could not afford. But the sight of her trembling and alone with an unborn child, counting on her survival, struck a chord deep inside him, a resonance of his own past losses. He remembered Sarah, her body weakened by illness, her fierce will to live. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the last decade, he bent and lifted the woman into his arms. She weighed less than he expected, her body weakened by hardship. He carried her inside the door, shutting out the lonely wind. The warmth of the cabin enveloped her, and she shivered violently. He laid her on a blanket near the fire, her eyes fluttering shut from exhaustion. When she woke, he had a cup of broth waiting. She pushed herself upright, her gaze cautious but direct. "I am Elena Martin," she said, her voice quiet but laced with an undeniable dignity. "My husband, Thomas. He took a job working for a man named Davies, the one buying up all the land. He brought me out here, promised me a new life. Then last week he just rode away. Said he was going for supplies and never came back." The name Davies landed like a stone in the quiet room. The land baron. Elena's husband worked for him. It was too much of a coincidence. "He worked for the land baron?" Jack asked, his tone sharp. Elena nodded, her eyes filling with tears she quickly wiped away. "Clearing land, marking boundaries. He said it was good, steady work." Jack's teeth ground together. He had seen men like Thomas Martin before, men who made promises with their mouths and broke them with their backs turned. But the connection to Davies felt wrong, a piece of the puzzle that was now stained with something far more sinister than a simple land grab. "You won't last out here alone," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. "Not in your state." "I know," she whispered, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. I had nowhere else to go. I am not asking for charity, Mr. Riley. I am asking for a chance. I can work. He studied her, the fragility of her frame, belying the strength in her eyes. Against his better judgment, against every rule he had set for himself, he felt something shift. The world had come knocking again, not as an enemy, but as a woman with a child, yet to be born. The walls of his fortress were being breached, not by force, but by a simple plea for help. "Drink the broth," he said simply. He turned away, staring into the flames. His solitude was over. He didn't know if that was a blessing or a curse, but as he listened to the soft sounds of Elena sipping the soup, he understood that Silas Kane was no longer the only complication that had found its way to his door. The rhythm of the ranch changed with Elena's presence. The silence, once a source of grim comfort for Jack, was now filled with the soft rustle of her movements, the quiet hum of a lullaby. She sang to her unborn child, the low murmur of her voice, as she thanked him for a cup of water or a piece of bread. He found himself moving with a renewed purpose, his chores no longer just a way to pass the time, but a means of providing for someone other than himself. He chopped more wood, checked his trap lines with greater diligence, and repaired a leak in the roof he had been ignoring for months. Elena, despite her advanced pregnancy and weakened state, refused to be idle. "I will earn my keep," she insisted, her quiet dignity a shield against her desperation. She mended his torn shirts with neat, careful stitches, swept the cabin floor until it was spotless, and kneaded dough for bread with surprising strength. A fragile truce formed between them, an unspoken understanding built on shared meals and the mutual recognition of the ghosts that haunted them. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the locket lay on the table between them, catching the flickering light. Elena's gaze fell upon it. "She was beautiful," she said softly. Jack's expression hardened into a granite mask. He didn't want to talk about Sarah, not with a stranger. But Elena's tone was not one of idle curiosity. It was laced with a deep, knowing sorrow. "It was a long time ago," was all he said. "Loss is never a long time ago," Elena replied, her hand drifting to her own stomach. "It lives inside you. My parents, they died of fever when I was a girl. I know what it is to be alone." Her words cracked open a door inside him he had long since bolted shut. He found himself telling her about Sarah, about the laughter they had shared, about the small home they had dreamed of building. He didn't speak of the raid at Willow Creek or the badge he'd thrown away. He spoke only of the man he had been before the mountains claimed him. In return, Elena spoke of her life, of her hopes for her child, of the betrayal that had left her stranded at the edge of the world. A bond, tentative and fragile, began to form in the shared space of their grief. That bond was tested less than a week later. They came at dusk, 3 riders silhouetted against the blood-red sunset. Jack saw them from the window, his body tensing instantly. They weren't Thorne's usual lackeys. These men rode with a grim purpose, their hands resting on their holstered guns. "Get down," he ordered Elena, his voice a low command. He grabbed his rifle from the rack above the door. Elena's face went pale, but she did as he said, sinking behind the heavy oak table. The riders fanned out, circling the cabin. Riley, one of them, shouted, his voice rough. "Mr. Davies wants a word. He says you've been ignoring his generous offer. He's not a patient man." "Tell Davies my answer is still no," Jack yelled back through the closed door. "That's the wrong answer." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. A gunshot exploded, splintering the wood of the doorframe just inches from Jack's head. The man he used to be took over. The years of practiced solitude fell away, replaced by the cold, calculating mind of a U.S. Marshal. He moved from the door to the window, his movements swift and silent. He saw one of the men dismounting, a torch in his hand. They weren't here to scare him. They were here to burn him out. He flung the shutter open, aimed, and fired. The shot was perfect, hitting the torch and sending it spinning harmlessly into a patch of snow. The rider cursed, scrambling for cover. Jack fired again, the bullet kicking up dirt at the feet of another man's horse, causing the animal to rear and bolt. The third rider opened fire bullets, thudding into the cabin walls. Elena huddled behind the table, her hands covering her head, her body trembling. Jack glanced at her, a flicker of the protector he once was igniting in his chest. He would not let them harm her. He would not let another life be ruined on his watch. He ducked below the window, reloaded, and moved to the other side of the cabin, firing from a new position. He was one man against three, but he knew the land, and he knew how to fight. He used the terrain, the shadows, the element of surprise. For 10 minutes, the valley echoed with the sound of gunfire. Jack moved like a phantom, his shots precise and deliberate, aimed not to kill, but to disable, to drive them back. Finally, with one man wounded and another unhorsed, the riders gave up. They retreated, firing a few last angry shots into the air before disappearing over the ridge, leaving behind only the smell of gunpowder and the deepening twilight. Jack stood in the silence, his rifle still warm, his heart hammering against his ribs. The dormant skills, the instincts he had tried to bury, had come roaring back to life. He turned to find Elena staring at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She was looking not at the quiet rancher who had given her shelter, but at the dangerous, capable man he had just revealed himself to be. "You were a lawman," she whispered. "It wasn't a question." Jack's expression shuddered, the mask of the solitary man falling back into place. He gave a curt nod, turning away to bar the door. A long time ago. But the glimpse was enough. The attack had not only driven off Davies's men, it had uncovered a part of Jack he thought was dead. And in doing so, it had solidified the protective bond he now felt for the woman and the unborn child under his roof. He knew then that this was no longer just about a land grab. The violence was escalating, and he was standing directly in its path. The attack on the ranch was a declaration of war. Jack knew he could no longer afford to be passive. The next morning, he rode into Redemption, the silver locket tucked securely in his pocket. The town felt different now, charged with a latent menace he hadn't noticed before. He saw Davies's men on street corners, their gazes lingering on him with open hostility. The town was being squeezed, and he was the last point of resistance. His first stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody sat behind his desk, nursing a cup of coffee, his face a roadmap of weary resignation. Jack placed the locket on the desk between them. "Silas Kane dropped this during the robbery," Jack said, his voice level. "It belonged to my wife." Brody picked it up, turning it over in his fleshy hands. He frowned. "That's odd, Jack. Kane's a drifter, a killer for hire. No connection to these parts that I know of. Probably just something he stole." "He killed Miller with a single shot, didn't waste a movement," Jack countered, a muscle working in his jaw. "And last night, Davies' men tried to burn down my ranch." "This isn't random, Brody. It's all connected." The sheriff sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, Jack, I know you're seeing shadows everywhere since everything. But Davies is just a greedy land baron. Annoying, but he's not stupid enough to hire a man like Kane. You're the one stirring up trouble by holding out. Maybe you should just take the man's offer. Settle down somewhere quiet. For your own good." The advice was dismissive, almost patronizing. Jack felt a prickle of suspicion. Brody was too quick to separate Davies from Kane, too eager to blame Jack for the violence. He was either incompetent or deliberately misleading him. Jack pocketed the locket, his expression grim. I'm not selling." He left the sheriff's office feeling more isolated than ever. He couldn't trust the law. He was on his own. His investigation led him to the telegraph office, where he sent a wire to an old contact in the U.S. Marshal Service, asking for any information on Silas Kane or any known associates of his dead brother Ethan. An answer would take days, if it came at all. He spent the rest of the day asking quiet questions around town in the saloon at the smithy, trying to piece together the structure of Davies's operation. He learned that Davies had appeared 6 months ago with a chest full of money and an army of hired guns. He worked through intermediaries, remaining a shadowy figure who was rarely seen. Thomas Martin, Elena's husband, was one of dozens of men who had been hired for odd jobs and then disappeared paid off or scared off once their work was done. As the sun began to set, Jack returned to the ranch, the puzzle pieces swirling in his mind. When he walked into the cabin, the warm smell of baking bread greeted him. Elena sat at the table, her hands busy mending another one of his shirts. A fragile peace settled over him, a stark contrast to the tension of the town. That night, they talked for hours. Spurred by the day's events, Jack told her everything. He told her about Willow Creek, about Ethan Kane, about the woman whose life he had shattered. He told her why he had left the Marshals, why he had chosen a life of solitude, convinced he was a curse. Elena listened without judgment, her eyes full of a deep, resonant empathy. When he was finished, the silence in the room was thick with unspoken understanding. "You carry a heavy burden, Jack Riley," she said softly. "But you are not a curse. You saved me. You saved my child. The man I see is not the one you describe." She placed her hand over her belly. "My Thomas. He ran from his responsibilities. You are running toward them, even when you think you are standing still." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. In her eyes, he wasn't a ghost or a failure. He was a protector. A fragile trust forged in the crucible of shared loss and imminent danger solidified between them. He looked at this woman who had lost everything but her dignity and felt the ice around his heart begin to crack. He was no longer just protecting a stranger. He was protecting Elena. He reached across the table, and his hand briefly covered hers. It was the first time he had willingly touched another person in years. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth that traveled up his arm. "We'll get through this," he said. And for the first time, he believed it. Together. The telegraph clattered to life 3 days later. The reply from Jack's old contact was short, cryptic, and chilling. No official record of a Silas Kane. However, Ethan Kane, the rustler from Willow Creek, did have a younger brother. A boy who was sent back east to a wealthy family for a proper education after their parents died. A boy who excelled at his studies, was known for his sharp intellect and cruel charm, and who disappeared completely 5 years ago. His name was not Silas. It was Samuel. Samuel Kane. The wire ended with a stark warning. Samuel worshipped his older brother. "Stay clear, Jack. This sounds personal." Jack stood in the dusty telegraph office, the flimsy paper trembling in his hand. Samuel Kane. Silas Kane. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with brutal clarity. The land baron Davies was a phantom affront. The land-grabbing scheme, the constant pressure, the attacks. It wasn't about property. It was about him. Silas Kane, the educated, well-spoken killer, was Ethan's younger brother, and he had returned for revenge. The entire operation had been a meticulously crafted trap. Silas had orchestrated it all to systematically dismantle Jack's life, to isolate him, to terrorize him, to force him to feel the same profound loss that Silas had felt when his brother died. The bank robbery wasn't about money. It was a performance, a way to announce his presence and deliver the locket, a symbol of Jack's own lost love, a cruel mirror to the wife Ethan Kane had left behind. Silas didn't just want Jack dead. He wanted to break him first. A cold dread washed over Jack as he raced his horse back toward the ranch. He had brought Elena directly into the path of a man seeking methodical personal vengeance. His fortress of solitude had become her cage. He had thought he was protecting her, but he had only made her a target. He burst into the cabin, his face pale, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "We have to leave," he said, his voice ragged. "Now." Elena looked up from the table where she was folding a small blanket she had made for the baby. Fear flared in her eyes at the sight of his panic. "Jack, what is it? What's happened?" "It's not Davies," he explained, pacing the floor like a caged animal. "It's the man from the bank, Silas Kane. This has all been about him. He's the brother of a man I killed years ago. He's here for me, Elena, and he will use you to get to me." The color drained from her face. Her hand went to her stomach, a reflexive gesture of protection. "Then, we fight him," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We don't run. You don't understand the kind of man he is." Jack's voice rose edged with a desperation he couldn't contain. "He enjoys this. The planning, the cruelty. This ranch isn't safe. Nowhere near here is safe." Before Elena could reply, the smell of smoke drifted through the open window. A thick, acrid scent that was far too close. Jack's blood ran cold. He ran to the door and threw it open. The horizon was on fire. Flames licked up the dry grass of the valley, a wall of orange and black smoke advancing on the ranch, pushed by a strong wind. From the ridge above, he could see them, a half-dozen riders' torches held high. Leading them, sitting calmly on a black stallion, was Silas Kane. He wasn't wearing a mask. His smile was visible even from a distance, a beacon of triumphant malice. Silas had escalated his campaign. Enraged that Jack was fighting back, that he had found a reason to live in Elena, Silas had decided to burn it all to the ground. "Get your things," Jack yelled, his mind racing. "We're going out the back toward the creek." But as Elena scrambled to grab a small bag, a sharp cry tore from her lips. She doubled over, her hands clutching her belly, her face contorted in pain. "Jack," she gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "The baby. I think it's coming." The world narrowed to two impossible realities, the fire consuming the valley before them, and the life fighting its way into the world behind them. There was no escape. They were trapped between the inferno and the monster who had lit it. The world became a nightmare of smoke and fire. The roar of the approaching flames was a living thing, a hungry beast devouring the dry valley grass. Jack grabbed Elena, helping her to her feet, as another contraction seized her body. Her breath came in ragged sobs, a mixture of pain and terror. "The creek," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "It's our only chance." He half-carried, half-dragged her out the back of the cabin, the home he had built with his own hands, without a backward glance. The heat was already intense, the air thick with embers that stung their eyes and choked their lungs. They stumbled toward the line of willows that marked the creek bed, and the sound of the fire growing louder with every heartbeat. Behind them, the riders led by Silas Kane descended the ridge, their whoops and hollers swallowed by the inferno's roar. They weren't pursuing. They were watching, savoring the destruction. This was the crescendo of Silas's symphony of revenge. They reached the creek just as the fire swept over the ranch. The cabin ignited with an explosive whoosh, the dry timber catching instantly. A wave of heat washed over them, forcing them into the shallow, ice-cold water. Elena cried out as the shock of the cold hit her, her body arching in pain as another contraction stronger than the last ripped through her. "We have to keep moving." Jack urged his arm, a band of iron around her waist, guiding her through the current. "We'll follow the water down toward Redemption. It's too far to walk, but they won't expect us to head for town." The journey was a desperate, agonizing crawl. Every few minutes, Elena would collapse against him, her body racked with the pains of labor. Jack held her, murmuring words of encouragement, his eyes constantly scanning the smoke-filled landscape for any sign of pursuit. The fire raged on both sides of the creek, turning the sky a hellish orange. Their world was reduced to the narrow, watery corridor of survival. Hours bled together. Darkness fell, but the night was illuminated by the dying glow of the fire. They finally staggered out of the creek bed, miles from the ranch, soaked, freezing, and utterly exhausted. Redemption's faint lights were a distant glimmer on the horizon. Elena collapsed onto the ground, her strength completely gone. "I can't, Jack," she wept, her voice broken. "I can't go any farther." "Yes, you can," he said, his own voice raw. He knelt beside her, wiping the soot from her face. "We're almost there. The doctor in town, Doc Miller, he's a good man. He'll help us." He found his horse, which had broken free from the burning barn and had instinctively fled downstream. It was a small miracle in a night of horrors. He lifted Elena onto the saddle and led the horse on foot, his body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. Each step was an act of will. They reached the outskirts of Redemption as a strange, unnatural wind began to blow whipping dust into the air. The sky, already hazy from the fire, grew darker, the air thick and oppressive. A sandstorm was brewing, a tempest, gathering its strength on the plains. Jack led the horse straight to the doctor's office, a small clapboard building next to the saloon. He pounded on the door, his fist striking the wood with the last of his energy. Doc Miller, a kind-faced man with weary eyes, opened the door. His expression shifted from surprise to alarm as he took in their state, soot-stained, half-frozen Elena, moaning in agony. "Good Lord, Riley, get her in here." As they helped Elena inside and onto an examination table, the first gust of the storm hit the town. The wind howled, rattling the windows and driving a sheet of sand against the building. The door to the saloon across the way slammed open and shut on its hinges. Trapped inside its dimly lit interior, Jack could see several figures, Sheriff Brody among them. And standing near the bar, his back to the window, was the unmistakable silhouette of Silas Kane. He hadn't fled. He had come to town waiting. He knew Jack would bring Elena here. The fire wasn't the end of his plan. It was just the beginning of the final act. The storm had descended, trapping them all in this dusty, forgotten town. The final confrontation was no longer a matter of if, but when. Jack looked from Elena, her face a mask of pain, to the saloon where the architect of all this suffering waited. The doctor's office was a fragile sanctuary, and the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break. The sandstorm hit Redemption with the force of a physical blow. A wall of brown dust swallowed the town, erasing the world outside the rattling windows of the doctor's office. The wind screamed like a banshee, a relentless, deafening howl that vibrated through the floorboards. Inside the world was a bubble of kerosene light and rising tension. Doc Miller worked with practiced calm, his pragmatic voice a small anchor in the chaos. "The baby's coming," and soon he said, his brow furrowed in concentration as he examined Elena. "But the labor is hard on her. She's exhausted, weak." Elena's cries were sharp, torn from her by the relentless waves of pain. Jack stood by her side, holding her hand, his knuckles white. He felt utterly helpless. He could face a dozen men with guns, but he could do nothing against this primal force of nature, this agonizing miracle of birth. Her pain was a direct consequence of his past, a debt being paid by an innocent woman and her child. The guilt was a physical sickness in his gut. "Stay with her," the doctor said, looking Jack square in the eye. "She needs you." But Jack's gaze kept drifting to the window to the saloon across the street. Its windows were hazy with dust, but he could still see the figures moving within. Silas was there, waiting. This storm was his stage, and the saloon his theater. A clock on the doctor's wall ticked with agonizing slowness, each tick a countdown. Time was running out for Elena, and Jack knew he couldn't wait for Silas to make the first move. He had to end this now before Silas decided to bring his war into this room. He squeezed Elena's hand. "I'll be back," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Her eyes wide with pain and fear pleaded with him. "Don't go, Jack, please." "He won't stop until I stop him." He said the words tasting like ash. "This ends tonight." He checked his Colt, the familiar weight, a cold comfort in his hand. He pulled on his duster and stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly ripped the door from his hand. Sand blasted his face, blinding and suffocating. He pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth and staggered across the street, a ghost moving through a world of dust and fury. He pushed open the saloon doors. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer sweat and fear. The few patrons were huddled at tables, their faces pale in the lantern light. Sheriff Brody stood near the far wall, his hand resting on his gun, his expression unreadable. And at the bar stood Silas Kane. He was wiping a glass with a clean cloth, as calm as if he were enjoying a Sunday afternoon. He looked up as Jack entered, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "Marshal Riley Silas," said, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd have the courage to join me. A drink to celebrate the occasion." "It's over," Kane Jack said, his voice low and steady, his Colt aimed at Silas's chest. Silas laughed, a soft, genuine sound of amusement. "Over, my dear Marshal, it has only just begun. You see, you still don't understand. You think this is about land, about money." He set the glass down with a delicate click. "This is about justice. The kind the law you represent so poorly never delivers." He turned fully to face Jack, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire. "You don't remember my brother's face, do you, Ethan Kane? You shot him down at Willow Creek and called it justice. You took a husband from his wife, a brother from his family, and you never looked back. You just buried your guilt on some lonely ranch and pretended it didn't happen." The saloon was silent, save for the screaming wind. Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. "Your brother was a criminal. He made his choice. And you made yours." Silas's voice cracked like a whip. "You chose to be judge, jury, and executioner. So I have made my choice. I have spent 10 years planning this. Every step, every move designed to make you feel what I felt. The helplessness. The loss. I took your sanctuary." He gestured vaguely toward the storm. "And now I'm going to take your new family." As he spoke, he took a step away from the bar. Sheriff Brody moved at the same time, but he didn't draw on Silas. He drew on Jack. "Drop it," Jack Brody said, his voice heavy with regret. "It's for the good of the town." The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from Jack's lungs. "Brody, what are you doing?" "He's ensuring peace," Silas supplied smoothly, his smile widening. "The good sheriff and I have an understanding. He believes you are a magnet for violence, and that sacrificing you is a small price to pay to keep redemption quiet. He's been feeding me information for weeks. Completely and utterly alone." The realization hit Jack with the force of the storm outside. The law was corrupt, his allies were enemies, and the only thing standing between Silas and Elena was him. Just then, from across the street, a sound cut through the howl of the wind and the high-piercing cry of a newborn baby. Silas's head tilted, his smile turning feral. "Ah," he whispered, his voice full of cruel delight. "The guest of honor has arrived. It seems my timing is impeccable." He drew his own Colt, its barrel glinting in the lamplight. The showdown was here. A battle not just for survival, but for redemption. Jack stood against two guns, his past and present colliding in a maelstrom of dust and blood. In his mind, he saw Elena's face, heard the baby's cry. He had to choose. Would he be the cold-blooded killer Silas believed him to be, or the man of redemption Elena saw in him? His finger rested on the trigger, his soul hanging in the balance. The baby's cry was a catalyst, a clarion call that shattered the tense standoff. For Silas, it was a signal. For Jack, it was a reminder of everything he stood to lose. He fired first not at Silas, but at the lantern hanging above Sheriff Brody's head. The room plunged into semi-darkness as the lantern exploded, showering the corner with oil and glass. Brody cried out, momentarily blinded. In that split second of confusion, Jack dove behind an overturned card table, the wood splintering as Silas's first shot ripped through it. "A lawman's tricks," Riley Silas's voice echoed in the dim, chaotic room. "They won't save you." Gunsmoke choked the air. Dust swirled in from the raging storm outside. Jack fired from behind cover, his shots aimed to control the space. He heard Brody scrambling, cursing in the dark. The sheriff was a pawn, misguided and cowardly, but Silas was the true threat. Silas moved with a predator's grace, using the bar for cover, his shots precise and deadly. He wasn't a wild gunman. He was a hunter. "You feel it, don't you?" He taunted, his voice a low murmur beneath the storm's roar. "The fear. The knowledge that everything you care about is about to be ripped away. This is how my brother's wife felt, watching you stand over his body." Jack didn't answer. He focused on the sounds, the shadows, the instincts honed over a lifetime of violence. He heard a floorboard creak to his left, Brody trying to flank him. Jack fired a single shot into the floor at the sheriff's feet. Brody yelped and scrambled back, his nerve broken. The battle became a duel between Jack and Silas, a deadly dance in the shadows of the storm-swept saloon. Bullets tore through chairs, shattered bottles behind the bar, and ricocheted off the brass footrail. It was a fight of ghosts. With every shot, Jack saw the faces of the men he had killed, the weight of his past pressing down on him. Then came a lull. The shooting stopped. The only sounds were the howling wind and the heavy breathing of the men inside. "It doesn't have to end this way," Samuel Jack called out, using the name from the telegram. "Your brother is dead. Killing me won't bring him back. It won't give you peace." For a moment, there was only silence. Then Silas's voice came back, no longer mocking, but filled with a raw, bottomless grief. "Peace," he whispered. "There is no peace. There is only balancing the scales. An eye for an eye. A family for a family." Suddenly, the saloon doors burst open, and Silas made a break for the street, using the storm as his cover. He was heading for the doctor's office. He was going for Elena and the baby. Jack was out from behind the table, in an instant chasing him into the maelstrom. The world outside was a blurry nightmare of flying sand and debris. He could barely see Silas, a fleeting shadow in the brown haze. He raised his Colt, squinting against the wind, trying to get a clear shot. He saw Silas reach the doctor's porch. He saw the door begin to open. Doc Miller stood there, his face a mask of terror. Jack fired. The bullet struck Silas in the leg. He cried out, stumbling, his own gun falling from his grasp. He collapsed against the wall of the doctor's office, clutching his wounded leg, his face twisted in a mask of agony and disbelief. Jack staggered toward him, his own gun still raised. He stood over Silas, the wind whipping his duster around him. Silas looked up, his eyes filled with hatred, but also with a shocking vulnerability. He was no longer the puppet master, just a man broken by his own quest for vengeance. Here it was, the moral test, the climax of his long run from the man he used to be. The cold, efficient part of him, the U.S. Marshals, screamed to finish it, to end the threat once and for all. It would be justice, simple and clean. But then he heard the baby cry again from inside, a sound of pure, unblemished life. He saw Elena's face in his mind, her quiet strength, her belief in him. Killing Silas now wouldn't be justice. It would be an execution. It would make him the very man Silas claimed he was. Slowly, deliberately, Jack lowered his gun. He kicked Silas's fallen revolver away into the dust. "It's over," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The scales are balanced." The storm began to subside, its fury spent. The wind's howl softened to a mournful sigh. The dust began to settle, revealing the wreckage of the street. Inside the saloon, Sheriff Brody was being held at gunpoint by one of the braver patrons. The reign of terror was over. Jack turned his back on the groaning, defeated form of Silas Kane and walked toward the door of the doctor's office, toward the sound of new life. The storm cleared as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily quiet. The dawn broke over redemption, its pale light illuminating the sand-drifted streets and the scars of the night's violence. The air was cool and smelled of rain-soaked dust. Inside the doctor's office, a fragile peace reigned. Doc Miller, ever the professional, had tended to Jack's minor cuts and bruises. Elena was sleeping exhausted, but safe, a deep and healing slumber. In a small cradle beside her bed, a newborn baby girl wrapped in a clean white blanket slept peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, miraculous rhythm. Sheriff Brody was locked in his own jail cell, his betrayal exposed to the stunned townspeople. He sat with his head in his hands, a broken man who had sold his integrity for a false promise of peace. Silas Kane, his leg bandaged, was under heavy guard, awaiting the arrival of a territorial judge. He was silent and sullen, his grand plans for revenge reduced to a lonely cot and a future behind bars. He would be forced to live with the failure of his hatred, a punishment far more fitting than a quick death. Jack sat in a chair by Elena's bedside, watching the rise and fall of her chest, listening to the soft coos of the baby. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but beneath it, something else. A lightness. The heavy shroud of guilt he had worn for a decade had begun to lift. He had faced his past not with a bullet, but with a choice. He had chosen mercy over vengeance, life over death. When Elena finally awoke, her eyes found his immediately. A weak but radiant smile touched her lips. "You came back," she whispered. "I told you I would," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Her gaze drifted to the cradle. "She's so perfect, Jack." He nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He looked at the infant, at her tiny, perfect fingers and the soft down of her hair. He had fought for this life, for this family that had been thrust upon him. And in doing so, he had found his own way back. The town began to heal. People emerged from their homes, assessing the storm's damage, speaking in hushed tones about the night's events. They looked at Jack differently now, not as the reclusive, haunted man from the hills, but as the one who had stood against the storm and saved them all. They offered him help, food, a place to stay. The community he had held at arm's length was now reaching out to embrace him. He and Elena and the baby stayed with Doc Miller for several days, recovering their strength, surrounded by a quiet, supportive kindness that was as healing as any medicine. Weeks later, the High Valley was beginning to show the first signs of spring. Patches of green pushed through the scorched earth around the ashes of Jack's cabin. The sun was warm, the air crisp and full of the promise of renewal. Jack rode alone to a small forgotten cemetery on the far side of Redemption. He stopped before a simple wooden cross that marked the grave of Ethan Kane. The name was faded, weathered by 10 years of sun and snow. For a long time, Jack simply stood there, the silence of the plains his only companion. He pulled the silver locket from his pocket. He opened it one last time, looking at Sarah's smiling face. He had carried her memory as a burden, a reminder of his failure to protect her. But now he understood. Love was not a ghost to be run from. It was a foundation to be built upon. He had honored her memory not by hiding from the world, but by opening his door, by protecting the innocent, by choosing to live again. With a final quiet breath, he closed the locket and gently placed it at the base of the wooden cross. It was a gesture of atonement, of peace, of letting go. He was no longer a man, running from the ghosts of Willow Creek. He turned his horse and rode back toward the valley. As he crested the final ridge, he saw it. The frame of a new cabin was rising from the ashes, built with the help of men from the town. And standing near the half-finished structure, holding their daughter in her arms, was Elena. She looked up as he approached, and her smile was as bright and hopeful as the spring morning. He dismounted and walked to her, his steps sure and steady. He was no longer in exile. He was a man coming home. He gently touched the baby's cheek, his calloused finger a stark contrast to her soft skin. "I've been thinking about a name for her," Elena said, her voice soft. Jack looked from the child to Elena, his heart full. "I'm sure whatever you choose will be perfect." Elena's eyes shone with love and a complete, unwavering trust. "I want to name her Hope."